Namaste. Welcome to our session with the Atharva Forum. We are here today to interview Professor Gautam Desiraju. Professor Desiraju, many of you already know him. He is a very highly cited scientist, an international authority on a subject of structural chemistry. And he is a professor emeritus from the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. He is also affiliated with Bose Institute, Rishihud University, and UPES, Dehradun. Our session today, politically incorrect questions about India and science. As everybody knows, science is indispensable and critical for building our present, building our future, planning for the challenges that are going to come as a nation. India is blessed with wonderful natural resources, wonderful human resources, very highly educated. Our diaspora is achieving wonderful things wherever they go. All of us do probably have this nagging sense that we could be doing even better in the scientific world stage than we are currently. And we also need to be prepared to meet the challenges in the scientific world that are going to come our way as our country grows and develops. The questions touch upon some uncomfortable topics. So we're going to put them to Dr. Desiraju, who, with his very broad experience within the higher levels of the Indian scientific establishment over the last several decades, will be able to give us some valuable insights on. And we will be able to use these insights to tackle the challenges that we're going to be faced with in the near future. Please subscribe to the Atharva Forum if you haven't already on YouTube. Wonderful resource with many wonderful speakers. And welcome, Professor Desiraju.
Thank you very much, Anand, for these kind words of introduction. I have spoken for Atharva before, and it's a pleasure to be asked to speak again in the Atharva Forum about this whole business of politically incorrect or politically inconvenient questions about Indian science. So, what are these questions? Can I know, please?
Before we get into the politically incorrect questions, Dr. Desiraju, first, we must always begin with optimism and sweetness and pleasantness. So, why don't you tell us what are good things that are happening in Indian science, things to be proud of, things that you're very happy about?
Well, yes, there is lots to feel happy about. And the biggest thing is that it even exists, that there is a structure that has been put into place. Let us not forget that in 1947, when we became independent, we were a desperately poor country. In the year 1500, the income of the average Indian and the average Englishman were about the same. In 1947, the income of the average Englishman was 200 times that of the average Indian. So that will give you a measure as to how totally impoverished we were. The country had huge problems. The life expectancy for a man was 27 years old and for a woman 21. Literacy was abysmally low. The social inequalities were tremendous. And the country also was in the aftermath of partition, which caused a deep wound in the body politic itself. So, at a time like this, is science really going to be of an topmost priority? Clearly not. And there is no need why it should be at such a critical time. This country was asked to do in one shot, address very serious problems that other countries had taken centuries to address. We had to do all this at the same time. So, in such a scenario, especially in the 1950s, I would say, the fact that we even started setting up a system of science. The science, yes, it is done by individuals, and hopefully, during the course of this interview, I would be emphasizing repeatedly the importance of the individual researcher in science. It is paramount actually. But no collection of individuals can actually do the best he or she can do without a system. And I would say that in the 1950s, we were beginning to create a scientific system. So, this is basically the academic institutions, the universities, the national labs, the strategic scientific departments, and in general, the whole system of government funded science. Because in the early days of any country, most of the scientific work has to be funded by the government. There is no question of a private. Anyway, we didn't have much of an industry, even in things like chemical industry and stuff like that. There wasn't much of a well developed industry, certainly not to the extent of wanting to start supporting science. So the entire onus and responsibility fell on the government. So, considering all these things and the fact that we had little or to no money, I would say that setting up of this whole system took roughly about 20 years. Shall we say about 1950 to 1970? Most of the bits and pieces were there. We did have CSIR, which curiously dates to before independence. It started in 1941. So CSIR already existed, and but it was developed quite a bit in those early years, and it had a very special role to play in the development of science and the application of scientific results to the well-being of the common people. Now here's the other point about science. Normally countries that have done well in science are the rich countries. The moment a country started becoming rich, and I let us refer to the period after the Renaissance in Europe. Once a country started becoming rich, they had the time and leisure to start becoming curious. And this is what led to important scientific discoveries. So you will always find this pattern that rich countries start thinking about science. Now, once they start thinking about science, then they start doing some science, and some of these results will be quite good. And these good scientific results will then lead to applications which will make money, in other words, make the country richer. So, science makes the country rich, and the riches generate more science. So, this is a cycle that you will see throughout the world. And the fact that a poor country started aspiring to do science itself, I think, is quite remarkable. And it testifies to the vision and foresight of our early leaders. The fact that they even dared to start something like this. I mean, let's take our Department of Atomic Energy, which was set up in the 50s, and the Space Department, which was set up in the 60s. So all this was really, really early. I mean, the 60s were a decade of gloom in India. And yet we were already in the process of setting up the Indian Institutes of Technology. All the 5 IITs were going concerns by the early 60s even. So I think this is as you said, this is a very positive and good way in which we start the discussion. There was nothing wrong with our start, in other words.
That was a wonderful introduction, Professor Desiraju. And when you mentioned about the, shall we say, nearly parallel development of science and, shall we say, economy and wealth in India, I think the first thing that came to my mind was Ganesha and his wives, Siddhi, Riddhi, and Buddhi. So, and I feel like maybe our society, we've always given similar levels of importance to intellectual and spiritual accomplishment as we do to material success.
And don't forget, till the 10th century AD, India was one of the top countries in science. There's nothing to be ashamed about. At that stage, we knew lots of things that Europe didn't know at all. Rich countries do good science. India was a rich country, so it did good science. When you're a poor country, you can't do science. You can't do good science. There is a very clear economic connection between doing the science and whether you are able to do it or not. Science is expensive.
That gives me a good opportunity to segue into the core of our discussion today, which is going to be built around this paper that you had written in Nature way back in 2012. Title was Bold Strategies for Indian Science. And it's available for free on the internet. So I encourage all our listeners to go and read it. And in spite of Dr. Desiraju's very phraseful and optimistic assessment of everything, this conversation is also going to have a lot of hard criticisms of what we could do to improve. So recent years we have seen a lot of news about countries like the UAE, Turkey, Iran being able to produce some fairly good quality products, especially in the defense space. Like Turkish drones, the Bayraktar drones have been used a lot in the Ukraine war. Iran seems to be producing a fair amount of defense stuff on its own because of all the sanctions limiting its ability to get stuff from the outside. And recently, even the UAE, I believe, started producing some very high quality pistols, which I want to say it's trying to export to India even. We have such a large economy, a large educated population, and yet we don't seem to be able to be at par with even smaller and somewhat maybe less resourceful countries in producing some of these more technologically complex items.
Well, here, Anand, I might tend to disagree with you. In part, there are a great many issues you have raised in this single question. India need not be compared with Turkey and Iraq because we are much better than them. Iran. We are really much better than. What Iran and Russia and others have done are taken some niche areas in the semiconductor field, mostly, as you rightly point out, because of the sanctions, and using some combination of beg borrow steel mostly, they have generated a small know-how and got limited supply chains for niche aspects of the semiconductor business. In the process, they also have achieved a certain amount of independence from the Western system of the, let us call it the Amerisphere. Amerisphere means US, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea. So they have achieved a certain degree. We are actually been doing exactly this in the last 10 years. We have not tried to develop the whole scientific system in an ab initio way. That is what the whenever Bush model of letting, just funding blue sky research to an infinite extent and then slowly allowing the results to trickle over. And then you will get a Bell Labs with a transistor and all. No, we can't do that. No country can afford to do that. But what you mentioned in a limited context about Iran and Russia, India has done exactly that in the last 10 years because we have taken certain niche areas. For instance, the photocatalytic systems of generating hydrogen, which is an essential thing in the battery and the energy sector. India today has we are actually better than many foreign countries in this. And the countries know it. They know that we are doing better. So it's not that we are not doing better, it's just that maybe these things are not publicized. And why should they be publicized also? I mean, science is finally meant for the scientists and for the governments who, have commissioned this kind of work. And so, yes, there are certainly things that we have done. It doesn't appear in Twitter, you see. Sadly, what has happened today is that, scientific reputations are made and destroyed on Twitter. This is not the way. And actually, we have done quite a lot. And for example, people don't know that even in the area of rare earths, It started with monazite and cerium from those monazite sands in Kerala, but today there is a lot of work which is going on, which correctly remains a secret. So you see, it's not exactly that we are doing it in certain niche areas. We are not doing it everywhere. The liquid nanourea, for example, that has been made recently, this has really made a big difference, not only to the farmers because it is cheap, but it is also less injurious to the soil. If you take real urea and dump it, most of it is not used by the plant anyway, and all it does is it spoils the soil. And there are certain areas in India where they have had excessive use of conventional fertilizers. So, this whole idea of using nano fertilizer is something that has started only 3 4 years ago. Take our pharmaceutical industry. We realized at the time of COVID that we had a real problem with China. The fact that we were importing too much from China and that China could literally put a gun to our head at some point in time, because for most of the lifestyle diseases, the drugs which are sold in India are imported from China. Let us put it this way, in another way, we import about 90% of our stuff from China in the area of drugs. But among China's exports, India is only 15%, which means they don't really need us, but we need them desperately. So, what did the present government do? They started this production linked initiative scheme so that we start making these things in India. This is real Atmanirbhar, and this is something that has started post 2021. So, you see, it also illustrates that the old American model of having an infinite sum of money and funding 100,000 universities, and then out of all these some Nobel prizes, and then after that something something something, that kind of a method, whenever Bush method, even the US cannot afford it today. They cannot. China tried, but today you see the Chinese economy itself is flagging. And many recent commentators, this is not my area of expertise, have said that China has already reached its peak economy. But like all other powerful countries which have become very rich, the effects of this money go on for decades. Britain was its most powerful in 1890, but the scientific capabilities of Britain still continue after 130 years, because the lead that they got when they were at their peak was so good and so high that simply the after effects of that the countries can keep living off it. This is why I think even a country like the US and all that, it is something that will always dominate in the world of science. US also has seen its peak economy of the US, it has already seen, but it goes on for quite a long time, which means that at a certain point of time in a country's history, it has to do a serious investment in science. This we have not done. Okay, I've told you that we did some good things in the beginning by starting it off, and now we are doing some ad hoc things which are good because they solve our immediate problems. But this is not called, in my opinion, developing a huge sound scientific base. This we have not done. So if you ask me, the first 20 years were good for one reason. The last 10 years or so are good for some other reason. But the neither the past nor this is going to help us in a long run, not in the way in which it has helped Britain or China or America. The kind of investment they have put into science, the effects of that will go on for a very, very long time. I mean, it is only now, actually, if you ask me, that the domination of Britain in science has actually come down. Till about the year 2000, it continued, in terms of the ideas that were generated from there. Long after they lost their relevance as a, big empire and all those things, the scientific thing still continued over there, which means they did their best science, if you ask me, between 1800 and 1900. So that is so good that it has lasted them for another 100 years. This is in the nature of good science or a scientific investment, because you generate whole generations of students and generations of scientists one after the other, and good will beget better. This also what happens. So this is where, if you want now to come to the politically inconvenient things, this is where we have failed, and we have failed miserably.
Now, I guess we're in a little bit of a dichotomy. One is, of course, the what do we do in terms of the financial investments and the topics to investigate. I feel maybe we will focus on that a little bit later in this discussion. Maybe before that, we can get into, shall we say, the human side of things in the scientific establishment. You had diagnosed a few things within our psyche which potentially holding us back from reaching our full potential. So I'm just going to read out a few quotes I got from there. So one was, big problems in big countries usually emanate from a small number of core reasons. A consequence of the feudal mindset, colonialism and the previous invasions and all that, of course, is our unquestioning acceptance bordering on subservience to older people. In this part of the world, age is blindly equated with wisdom and youth with immaturity. A different quote: centuries of servitude, right up till 1947, have made the average Indian docile, obedient, and sycophantic. This mentality has had far reaching and debilitating consequences for research. Very few Indian scientists are known as opinion makers, trendsetters, or leaders. They follow obediently. And then finally, talking about corruption as a stumbling block. Corruption need not take a monetary form. In a national laboratory, it can mean acquiescing to the notion that one's administrative head is also one's scientific superior. By that logic, and given our civilian based system of administration, the secretaries in the science ministries in Delhi should be our most creative scientists. So I thought all of these quotes were quite funny, but also very perceptive. I mean, obviously, I've not been in the Indian scientific establishment, but just living in India and growing up there, I can see the truth of everything that you say, especially when you come out and see how things are done in other countries. So I believe one of our previous discussions, you had mentioned that perhaps if you had to boil it down, you might say there's a certain bravery and doggedness that maybe we lack vis-a-vis some other societies. So all that put together, Dr. Desiraju, what do you think we should be doing to cultivate that?
Well, Anand, there are two or three reasons that come together in a dirty convolution, which sort of explains our predicament. Now, the first thing is no money. So, well, there's no money also. I would have felt that, say, by 1975, 1980, we should have started putting more money into science. See, any country, self-respecting country today, puts about 2 to 3% of its GDP into R&D and education. Countries like South Korea, Israel, and so on put almost 4 to 5%. Now, in India, it is only about 0.65%. This is abysmally low. There is no excuse. Successive governments have made this lower and lower and lower. And this basically means there is not enough money for education. People are not thinking about education here. Science, it just doesn't sort of appear magically. You need a group of trained people to start getting interested in science, to take it up seriously, and for that you need a proper educational base. Now, that we don't have. Our education system today is a mishmash. Most of the students go to state universities who have no money. And when you have no money, you see, then you degenerate into crude corruption and that kind of thing. So there's nothing going on there, zero. As far as the central institutions are concerned, how can they solve the need of this huge population? Today, to add to the thing, this is becoming a huge aspirational population. People would like to work, but they would like to see that their work results in some benefit. So, somebody who works better should be able to get more rewards. And this again brings me to the next question: why are we fearful? In a atmosphere of no money, then the person who exercises administrative control over somebody else starts becoming powerful. And so, this very good system, which was set up, the scientific system with our labs and universities and departments, has actually now become a burden because the bureaucrats, scientific bureaucrats, have become too powerful. The entire CSIR system is badly in need of an overhaul simply because that structure itself gives so much power to the director and the deputy director and so on that they literally control the purse strings in a financially strained atmosphere. A scientist cannot do work without money because most of the science is experimental science, and even the non experimental parts of science require money to do for computation or whatever, some other kind of field work. So it is the administrative control on science, whether it is CSIR or DST, DBT, and so on, then the ministers and this Babu culture have really made it impossible for ordinary scientists to even lead a modicum of a dignified professional life. It has become really bad. And also, the thing is, it's become aspirational. See, 20 years ago, we opened up our PhD programs because, yes, the reservations have worked. A lot of people started getting qualified to take up PhDs and so on. And yes, indeed, we gave them money to start doing PhDs and doing research. Then what do you do with all these guys once they start getting their PhDs? In the old days, you could coolly say they can go away to America and then we solve our problem like that. But today, America doesn't want them also. It's got its own problems. It's not going to take an infinite number of Indian scientists. Anyway, that's no solution. You don't put in hard-earned taxpayers, Indian taxpayers' money to IITs just to say that the whole lot of them are going off to America, Silicon Valley. It doesn't prove anything. It just proves that we are stupid. Because nobody will make an investment of this kind just to see somebody else take the benefit of your investment. Which is what I mean the US is doing if you take it one way or the other. So basically, it all coming back to this money. Corruption, I don't think inherently we may not be corrupt. The corruption has come because of the lack of money. And this Babugiri, it has to go. This is because this Babugiri has even come into the university system. It's not just the national labs. Okay, national labs, you can say CSIR. It has to do, it's a government lab, so it has to do the government mandated programs. But say something like Indian Institute of Science or Banaras Hindu University or even the state universities, Pune University, Jodhpur. Scientist there has to be able to do certain blue sky research, blue sky work, which catches his or her fancy. Because out of these things come the real big discoveries. Real big discoveries don't happen because the government says tomorrow you have to develop a better way of fabricating a semiconductor chip. That's very important strategically. It's not that that's not important. But the big breakthrough, who were the first guys who made that silicon chip? It was the people in Bell Labs who were doing hardcore solid state physics research. They knew they were working for a lab which was profit making, fine. But still, they were first class scientists. Bell Labs got many Nobel Prizes, including the one for the semiconductor. So, it is again, I don't want to make too much of these Nobel Prizes, Getting a Nobel Prize doesn't mean that the whole country is good in science. And above all, Indians should know that if an NRI scientist is getting a Nobel Prize, he is not an Indian. First, they should know that. You see, the state of demoralization of our people is so much that any NRI Indian person gets some Nobel Prize, then suddenly we feel it's an Indian Nobel Prize. When that Grameen Bank person, got Nobel Prize from Bangladesh, I think our famous Bengal chief minister said it was great that Bengal had got a Nobel Prize. That's all. That was her comment on this issue. This again comes from this colonial thing, Anand. Why should Western approval mean so much? And here I think we have something to learn from the Chinese. They do their work, they have put in a lot of money, they cite each other, they know exactly what is going on. Much of their scientific research is done in the Chinese language. They will publish in English because now they've realized their clout. But there is no hint of wanting that Western approval for your scientific ideas. If a scientific idea is good, the whole world will recognize it. You don't need to run to somebody to get their approval and things like that. But so it's a fairly long answer to because but your question itself had many parts to it. So I hope I've addressed this business of no money, lack of self-respect, the heavy-handed babugiri. Well, that is the first thing that has to go. And that is something which is well in the power of the present government to do. It is not so difficult.
Excellent. That's a very
I would feel
comprehensive.
even these IITs and universities and all that, they need to choose their own directors and vice chancellors by themselves, which is what is done in all countries of the world. You don't have an outside selection committee appointed by a minister, some minister ticking, chief minister ticking. These things don't happen. A university in Europe elects its own rector. A US university elects its own chancellor or whatever they're called. You don't have a government, a central government or state government coming and putting selection committees and some group of old men coming and pontificating and choosing something, because this again leads to other problems. Once the initial lot are mediocre, which is what has happened, they were mediocre, they are mediocre, no doubt about it, then they will continue to generate people who are even more mediocre. It is well known in academics that a first rate scientist only wants to talk to other first rate scientists. But a second rate scientist only wants to talk to a fourth rate scientist. A second rate scientist feels uncomfortable in the presence of another second rate scientist because he looks at him as some kind of a rival. Because he knows he's got some deficiencies. A first rate scientist never feels that because he says, okay, I'm doing fine, he's also doing fine. There's no conflict there. You wanted politically inconvenient, that's why I'm talking. I'm not coming here, and this is not a partisan discussion. I will consider all bureaucrats in this category, all ministers in this category. I don't care which party they belong to. It's got nothing to do with that. Because in the end, most forms of science have nothing to do with politics at all. It is only certain strategic aspects which have to do with national security, this and that. And usually those are matters where the political parties do not disagree with each other. One of the reasons I think people always ask me, why was ISRO so successful? Why was DAE so successful? How is it that these departments did not face political interference? So that when a government changed and a government of some other party came, the ISRO policies or the DAE policies did not change. If you think about it, the answer is quite simple. You see, if you do something great, tomorrow if Chandrayaan lands properly on the moon, Chandrayaan 3 lands properly on the moon, it's not going to give the BJP extra votes. If Chandrayaan 3 fails to land properly on the moon, it is not going to deny the BJP any votes. Similarly, if Chandrayaan 3 lands properly, Congress is not going to lose votes because of that. Conversely, if Chandrayaan 3 does not land properly, Congress will not gain votes because of that. So, when political parties stand to neither gain nor lose whatever happens in those departments, the consequence is very simple. They don't care about it. It's not worth their while to mess around with the policies of those departments. And ISRO and DAE is a very good example as to what great heights this country can go to without political interference. Because don't forget, people don't realize that ISRO was working with a shoestring budget and continues to work with a shoestring budget. I think the present regime were the first ones to even increase it slightly. Till 2014, ISRO's budgets were all very, very, very mean. And so they couldn't do more than what they're doing. So, but even then they did, which means the political interference every 5 years you don't get a change. But if you take a field like education, admissions, colleges, IIT, Central University, Madras University, Coimbatore University, then the politicians are interested because there are votes there, you see. That's why they muck into all those places. And the other thing is, because of all this, education has yet not become a voting issue. It has never become an electoral issue. You somehow, if you are able to make it into an electoral issue, you watch. All the politicians will become very careful about what they say and do. They won't start talking about self-respect movements and all that. They'll stop all that immediately. So this is the actual fact of the matter. So bureaucrats, politicians, no money. So I would say that these are the sort of three bhoots that we have had to contend with. So where do poor scientists stand in the middle of all this? Many of them after some time feel that they could have chosen an easier profession. Because believe me, it is an extremely hard profession. One of the hardest. And this other misnomer has to be removed from the minds of young people. It has to be forcibly removed. Simply by working hard, you do not become intelligent. By working hard, you will get certain results, which come as a result of your hard work. That you will get. But just saying somebody worked so hard that he came first in IITG and therefore he will become the next Newton, that's rubbish. Finally, Newton was just relaxing. He was not working very hard when he saw the apple falling. There was a plague epidemic. So just like our COVID, he went home. And he was just sitting, lounging, relaxing. He saw the apple. He was not studying for IITG. So this business of equating IITG with, genius and all. See, these are all things that, we have to start thinking about.
That actually connects to my next question in a very interesting way. When you talked about how the Chinese don't have the same awe necessarily of the Western scientific establishment as the Indians seem to do. As somebody who's in fairly close view of the Western establishment, at least in the medical field for the last several years, I do feel that winds of change are blowing, and the scientific establishment here seems to be eating itself from within, primarily by the spread of this woke ideology. Now, just like how you're saying people are running behind the mantri, at least in India, if they're running behind a physical individual, that's one thing. Here, it has almost come to pass that the elite places of science, like the New England Journal of Medicine or Nature, are now saying that your science must conform to woke political messaging. If not, you will be banned or cancelled, and like your prestige will be revoked and all that. And so there is definitely going to be a chilling effect on science as self-respecting people, intelligent people who are unwilling to toe the obviously false ideology are no longer going to be interested in working in large scientific establishments, because there is at least there is some amount of self-respect that everybody has. And if it's been said that the purpose of propaganda in the Soviet Union was not to inform but to humiliate. So because when you have told people that this is something patently ridiculous and they're forced to accept it, that shows them how powerless they are, and so they are willing to accept a lot more. So what does it mean when like, obviously, how you said, like, Britain did like extraordinarily good work 1800 to 1900, and they're still coasting on that. America did like exceptionally wonderful work, but if this comes to pass alongside their economic stagnation, which people are worried about, it is unlikely that the West and Europe will retain its leadership role in science in the decades to come. So China is, of course, poised, as you say, to take advantage of this. How do we in India take advantage of this opportunity? Like, one risk, of course, being that because of our vast English speaking population and our, like, the sending people to America and Europe, as you said, we are maybe very predisposed to bring this woke infection back into our place, and that little beautiful things that we have built maybe in like ISRO and DAE, we run the risk of even losing that.
Well, here again, several different interesting points you have brought up. I must say that I like your questions because each one of them tells that you have actually thought about this topic a great deal before you're asking these questions. The woke thing is there without a doubt. And I think if you look at the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, the last 200 years they were all woke. Okay, they were celebrating their birthday parties of their dogs and cats, spending lots of money on that and stuff like that. So gradually, so woke happens whenever somebody becomes too rich. So woke will happen. But at the same time, like what I said, the spillover effect of science is so long that I don't see the okay. You may never have again a country where a situation in the world where one country is so much more powerful than all the others. Now, some of these details, it's very interesting, are described in more detail in a book that will be appearing shortly, which I have written. It is about the India's supply chains in a changing world. So it's basically a scientific type book which takes some of these areas where India needs to think very hard and serious about its supply chains. And the main challenge here is the changing world part. Now, I personally see and I justify in my book a situation whereby about 2040, which is just less than 20 years from now, you are going to have four countries, and we call them, I have a co author for this book, so that's why I say we. We call them four empires, the four new empires. And these would be respectively America, China, India, and Russia. Physical empires are costly, so we will do empire through the mind, through software, through this woke culture, through all these other things that are happening. So, in this kind of a situation where these four empires are sometimes friendly with each other, sometimes inimical, the world will go on. Please remember, go back to Europe around 1900. There were four or five big empires that were all getting along and they dominated the whole world. So, if you ask me by 2050, 2060, you will have these four empires that are dominating the whole world. In this kind of a scenario, in the Indian planners and policymakers will have to worry about how to project science into this kind of a changing world. What topics do we take up? What cannot we afford? What must we take up, whatever be the cost of it? There will be some topics like that too. How do you prioritize? So you see, somewhere thinking people have to start questioning in a big way. This will happen definitely, Anand, because the number of government jobs is also falling. These government jobs, let me tell you, is another big reason why we have fallen back so much. Government jobs, whether in universities, in IITs, ISERs, or the national labs, the salaries are too high, the responsibilities are too low, and the security is too high. No accountability. If you have no accountability and infinite security, then what will happen? They'll just sit and drink tea the whole day. They don't have to do anything. So this is another thing that needs to be thought about. And in a way, it is good that the government is running out of money to give these government jobs, because gradually it will happen that the government will start phasing out. And if you take rich and successful countries in science, they have not relied so much on government jobs. Just think about it. When you live in the US, so you have a good proportion of state universities, and you also have a good proportion of the private universities. And some of the best universities are private universities, which are also very, very rich. The East Coast Ivy League things, they are all private. So there is nothing bad about private sector and the educational system. And I think this is where the private sector has to come in a big way. Government has to extend a facilitating hand and not treat the private sector like criminals. So good deal of give and take needs to be there. And this is something that I think both the government sector and the private sector will understand. They understand that they'll have to get together somehow, otherwise both will collapse. So I think, but the present government is making a lot of moves in this direction. I mean, take space, which we have spoken about in such a favorable way. The private sector investment in space is now a reality. And this is something that would have been unimaginable in the previous socialistic pattern of society and all those things that we had. It would have been simply unimaginable. So it again called for a great deal of vision and forward looking thinking. The private sector has come forward today in this Chandrayaan 3. So many little bits and pieces, so many have been put together by private companies. Government cannot do everything. This Ma-Bap culture of the socialistic pattern of society and idea of India and all that is not going to work anymore. It's almost comical to see some people in some political parties saying that the credit for Chandrayaan 3 has to be given to certain politicians who have been dead and gone for 50, 60 years. There must be some element of self-correction being put into all our scientific bodies. It cannot be, this remedying or improving cannot come from outside committees. I think this calls for a certain change in the mental attitudes of the people themselves. But this is something that the government can and should start helping.
When you mentioned that point about the space program requiring so much public-private cooperation, that actually reminded me of a very, very positive and wonderful article that came out in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about the role that all these little tiny private companies in Hyderabad and Bangalore played in contributing to the success of Chandrayaan. And I thought that was wonderful because it was the same newspaper that a few years ago had published that really horrible cartoon of like some poor farmer with like a cow kind of knocking at the door where all these rich countries are sitting and
No, in fact,
trying
I read
to
that article
launch a
myself,
space
Anand,
program.
and I was wondering why, after 100,000 articles against India, he suddenly writes this one. I thought something might have happened there.
Somebody was saying something good. I was
No, no,
shocked.
something has happened. Whatever it is, New York Times, Washington Post. Finally, everything, money is the one that makes the world go round. So I'll make somebody say anything I want to if I give him enough money. So I am afraid I'm being rather cynical about this, but I don't think it's anything more than that. So the fact that New York Times praises
Okay,
us
that's useful to
to
understand.
me means nothing. It means nothing.
On this topic of private public partnership, you in your excellent nature paper in 2012, you had suggested that we should have like a barbell strategy in terms of picking our projects, which you of course briefly touched on before, where we fund like a moderate number of really out there blue sky projects with like maybe single investigator, and then targeted investment into high priority, maybe national importance projects, which you said maybe energy, water, and public health with high accountability. So, in your opinion, what should be the role of the private and public sectors when you kind of dichotomize or prioritizing into these two baskets? Similarly, I guess it's a related question. IISc seems to be like one of those beautiful shining success stories. And we had also talked about how a lot of our really big universities were founded by grants from really wealthy Maharajas and all that. But of late, in the last whatever several decades, we don't seem to have an equal number of high profile private institutions dedicated to science and research being set up. And so, if you could touch on that, both in terms of choice of topics, private versus public industry, and also how should we entice wealthy individuals and all that into funding and supporting Indian science?
The two are connected. The 2 points are connected. And I think since we've already spoken for some length of time, I'll be fairly fast. The first point, namely the barbell, I think that's the way to go, absolutely. And just to give the listener of this podcast an idea of the sums of money we are talking about, when I say blue sky individual researcher, I'm talking about anybody in today's rupees, a project of about 1 crore over a 3-year period is what I will call a small project to an individual researcher. So, roughly about 30 lakhs per year for 3 years. So, these could be on a variety of things which would be evaluated uh, by like a peer review, which you would do for a journal. And it again need not be a committee of wise old men. It could be, some kind of a. I mean, I get projects to evaluate from Lithuania, from Poland, from UK. I get Australia. I mean, they are lots of them. Many of them I say I can't do it because I receive so many such requests. But we should not be scared to send our proposals to Bulgaria for a referral. This is another thing we don't do, by the way. I don't know how many of the viewers know that none of our projects in many of these organizations are ever being sent to referees outside India. I think this is, again, I don't know why this is the case, but it is like that. So anyway, once you do that and if you are able to finance, then it doesn't matter if some of these projects, most of these projects, if they don't click. At the maximum, you will be able to also train some good PhD students. You will get some papers and so on. You will not, get shoddy stuff or incompetent stuff, but it may not be some earth-shattering. But 1 in 1,000 in this category, you may get very good things. And so that's what you're banking on. And this only the government can do because these are all what can be called risky small investments. So you counter this risky with this small. So you don't make risky big investments. Now the big investments are all for these very huge one will be Chandrayaan 3, but even things in the rare earths side or semiconductor side and things like that. Now we are talking about 100, 200, 300, up to 1,000 crore projects, things like that. These have to be correctly the responsibility of the private sector and the government working together in some sort of a formula. And government also should be generous to the private sector in terms of the royalties or the benefits of some of these things, that if these projects yield properly, what does the private component get out of it? Because private sector is a profit making thing by its very definition. So they are not going to come in and start supporting people just for thing. Now these Maharajas, you see, that is really different. See, they were all upholders of Dharma. So I would say that, and plus they were fiercely imbibed with this freedom movement, and they wanted to do and they wanted to help the movement and the country itself. It was, Nehru's hatred of the royals that actually dismantled the whole thing when he removed the some key provisions in the constitution, that owning land and stuff like that. So then once they are deprived of their land, they are deprived of their money. And so this whole system came crashing down. And why would Ambani or Adani or somebody, support all this? So many years ago, you had a wonderful thing in Air India, and Nehru just grabbed it and nationalized it. And after 75 years, they were forced to give it back to the same fellow from whom they took it. They seem to have slowly realizing that this particular government may not be so horrible to them as the Congress. And because they are the ones who control the money today. As India is becoming richer, who is getting the money? Is coming into the private through the private sector. They are the ones who are generating all the jobs and all the people and everything. So you have to take them much, much more seriously. India is being made now, you see, Anand. India is not yet completely made. It's a work in progress, very much work in progress.
Can you also very briefly touch on the founding of IISc? And it was, it wasn't just a case of a rich man putting some money in. So I think that was a very
I would ask people interested in this question to see that podcast which I did with Abhijit Chawda about 2 months ago, and where I talked about the key role of some of these people like Tata and Maharani and Vivekananda, and then their successors in the next generation. A total of 6 people in all uh, were responsible for the setting up of this wonderful institution. And I think it is because you had religion and you had money and you had a business entrepreneurship. The royal family, the Maharani gave the land, which is the money basically, and people don't know that she a considerable amount of the running expenses of the institute in the early years were given by her son, the Maharaja. And Tata also gave, but many people seem to feel that only Tata gave the money. This is not true. Tata gave, royal family also gave. And the essential religious background, which Vivekananda and then Sister Nivedita, when they provided. So you need all these things, you see. You need the dharma, you need the artha, and then you need the ability to make that money and manage it properly. So when you have all these things, that is the sort of a dharmic place, which will not happen in a sort of a government structure with some rule number so and so and this and that, because government places are just government places. They are not the Indian Institute of Science.
That is a brilliant way to put it, and I think that also maybe ties into what you had said earlier about hard work does not necessarily make you brilliant, because there is always an X factor, which perhaps people may call it divine
No, I
factor
tell
or
you,
something.
I will even take a contradictory opinion. An
Okay,
intelligent person sometimes can be extremely lazy,
true.
and they know when to exercise their brains. So a person who is senselessly hardworking without any intelligence is one of the most dangerous people you can have around in the workplace. Because he's
uh, uh,
extremely energetic and hardworking and he's doing everything wrong.
okay. Um, so I know we've kind of overshot our time, but I have two questions that I hope we'll be able to get to. One takes off from what you had said about the fact that India has a lot of talent. It's not, you can't say that certain people have talent, other people don't, and like, so merit is very widely and richly distributed in our society. For example, like, my biggest example of this was when I was an MBBS student in Ames. My next door neighbor was this guy from like a place, very small place, very, very far away. Like it took 2 days to reach there from Delhi, even though it was just like, in Madhya Pradesh or something. So, but he was so brilliant. He studied in Hindi medium until 10th standard, but then he learned English, got into MBBS. And then by the middle of MBBS, he was reading philosophy of European guys in English, and like just crystallized it so easily in his head. And he was able to debate other people, and so far beyond what we could even imagine doing, showing that, like, irrespective of whether it's Bombay or Bangalore or some really small town, brilliance and talent is available in vast amounts. Now, that being said, you are a crystal scientist. You study how crystals emerge, meaning essentially people don't realize it. People think chemistry is crystal, whatever, but the truth is, in a crystal is a very is a very source of great insights, because it is the emergence of order. From that perspective, what insights do you have if we were trying to create institutions of excellence, or to catalyze, like, shall we say, like a critical state, or get into a phase transition to create the next level of scientific ability? for India's future?
Yeah,
You know,
it's a very nice question, but it would almost be a topic for another presentation. So, it's a question of getting critical masses together, a nucleation of minds, nucleation of a certain body of opinion. Like I have talked about scientists and educated people opening their voices. So, people sitting and complaining to each other over a cup of tea is not it. When people get into a townhouse situation where they are able to start discussing these things, then you are developing a critical mass. Because once a person knows that there are others who share his or her opinion, then he or she becomes that much more confident in expressing himself or herself. So I think there are certain elements there that it has to do with what is the critical number of people who need to get together, and it will happen as there is more money. It all boils down again only to money, Anand. So you make money in some legitimate way, and you make enough of it, then all the other things will start falling into place.
okay, wonderful. And so, last question we will get into. So, essentially, money. I happened to see this very fascinating graph on Twitter a few days ago, in fact, which ties right into this question. There is almost like a direct correlation between per capita electricity generation and utilization and income. So, is it purely just a correlation, or is it that to become rich, you need to be more able to generate useful energy and then put it to work for you? So, in that sense, if as many people are predicting, there's going to be an energy crisis that's going to be staring us in the next few decades, as easy to access hydrocarbons run out. Should What should India be focusing on in terms of ensuring its energy security? And as a
So do
chemistry
this
expert,
do this barbell thing. Try to make small nuclear fusion reactors, which other countries are doing. So if we are able to really make breakthrough in nuclear fusion, then this entire all other forms of energy we can forget about it. We don't need it; becomes irrelevant. So if you want to use barbell, you can go for that, and at the same time, stick to conventional things. I mean, liquefied natural gas, Qatar, Turkmenistan, they are all into that because even Saudi realizes that era of petroleum may be over. So it is a correlation, yes. Because the more energy you use, that means you are becoming more advanced. Absolutely, there will be a correlation. Okay. I hope you like all the responses and that I was sufficiently politically inconvenient.
no,
And
absolutely, it was fantastic, and like I've always been impressed by your vast knowledge and your ability to answer to any question, even if it's not necessarily in your field that you work in, and you just proved that again. I think all our listeners will also appreciate that you don't miss a beat, so you always have.
yeah, when you can do research in one area properly, you can do research in any other area because that is the nature of research. It is not subject dependent. It is
Excellent.
to
That's
do with
a
the
wonderful
research
message.
activity itself. It's to do
Yeah.
with the research activity itself.
Brilliant, brilliant. Very, very wonderful insight. That's like if you're able to acquire and structure information in one domain, that skill will translate to every other domain essentially.
It will. It will.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Desiraju. That was very useful for me, and I think it'll be very helpful for a lot of our listeners. Thank you so much again. And people who are listening, please don't forget to subscribe to the Atharva Forum channel on YouTube. They have a lot of fascinating interviews with Dr. Desiraju as well as many other leaders in their field. Thank you so much. Have a
Thank you,
good day.
Anand, so much for taking the time and being so patient with me.
Absolutely.